Who do you think I am? You think I want you dead? I'll be broken when you die.
There sat down once a thing on Henry's heart, so heavy. If he had 100 years and more, and weeping, sleepless, in all them time, Henry could not make good.
If you're so obsessed with Succession that the YouTube algorithm has fed you this incredibly obscure video by an even more obscure channel, then you're probably already aware of the fact that the titles of each of the season finale episodes so far have all come from the same poem. And that's Dream Song 29 from John Berryman's The Dream Songs. And if you're aware of this fact, then maybe you've been wondering, well, what the heck does Succession actually have to do with this collection of poetry? Is it simply that maybe the head writer or someone in the writer's room happens to love John Berryman, happens to love the Dream Songs? Is it just kind of an Easter egg for really obsessive viewers to pick up on? Or is there some connection between these poems and the series? I'm a huge fan of Succession, but I'm also a huge fan of the Dream Songs. It's one of my favorite collections of poetry, and I think a really underappreciated poetic work. It's significant enough that Berryman did win the Pulitzer Prize for the first collection that came to make up the Dream Songs, 77 Dream Songs, and ended up winning the National Book Award for the Dream Songs themselves. But since his death in the early 70s, the collection has kind of slipped into obscurity a little bit. It's still a staple of some college undergraduate level modern poetry courses and that kind of thing. But it doesn't have the kind of cultural cachet that some of Berryman's contemporaries, like, say, Sylvia Plath, still have. You don't see even, like, poetry nerds or whatever talking about the Dream Songs the way that you'll see them talk about, you know, The Wasteland or some other major poetic work that still gets a lot of publicity today and that still has its little, you could say, fandoms today. And I think that's a shame, but it also raises the question of how did this poem that's not super well known outside of academic circles, I suppose, end up with its fingerprints all over one of the more popular and critically acclaimed prestige series of today? It's a question that intrigued me, just because I'm such a big fan of the collection and such a big fan of Succession. So what I decided to do, just to satisfy my own curiosity more than anything, is to go back and really reread the Dream Songs with a thought to how they might connect to Succession. And my initial thought was, well, I'll pick out a few broad thematic connections between the two artistic works and maybe make one video where I try to tie them together. But what I quickly discovered was there are way more parallels than I expected. And if I just dive down that rabbit hole, I could end up with a video that's like an hour or more long, which would be, number one, just really impossibly cumbersome for me to record, given how little experience I have doing this, and my desire to do something kind of spontaneous and unscripted. And also, two, we'd end up with something that I wouldn't think would be very digestible for an audience. So what I decided to do instead is to record a bunch of shorter videos, with each video really focusing on a single connection that I found between the poems and the series. So I want to start with a big one. I want to start with what I think might be the most significant and obvious connection between the dream songs and Succession. And that's father figures. And more specifically, father figures whose influence you can't escape. Father figures who live as oppressive phantoms within the heads, within the psychology of their own children. So a little history here. And I'm going to have to be a little euphemistic about this because it touches on a subject that YouTube is notoriously cagey about. But John Berryman's father took his own life when Berryman was very young. So that's the kind of traumatic childhood event that you really don't get over. And as a result, the memory of Berryman's father and the memory of Berryman's father's death looms large over the entirety of the Dream Songs. There are multiple poems in this collection that directly reference Berryman's father and his passing. And there are other poems that refer kind of obliquely to them. And this includes actually Dream Song 29. And this is the poem, as I mentioned before, where the titles of the first, second, and third season finales come from. So the title of the fourth season finale has not been announced yet, but we can expect it's going to come from this poem too, if they follow routine, if they follow pattern. And maybe in a future video, if I manage to record one before the episode title is announced, I might speculate based on the poem on what some possible titles could be. But setting that aside for now, Dream Song 29 actually opens with a stanza that appears to be referencing the death of Berryman's father. And I'll read some of it really quick here. There sat down once a thing on Henry's heart so heavy, if he had 100 years and more, and weeping, sleepless, in all them time, Henry could not make good. So it's fair to assume that that thing that lay so heavy on Henry's heart, that lay so heavy on Berryman's heart, Henry being Berryman's kind of alter ego for the purpose of the poem. It's more complicated than that, but let's leave it at that for the sake of brevity.
My second wife and I once were walking down Hannaford Avenue in Minneapolis one evening in the direction of a bar. And we decided that the names that we disliked most were feminine, Mabel, and masculine, Henry. So, in an affectionate, sweet way, we began to, I would call her Mabel and she would call me Henry.
It's fair to say that this thing that weighs so heavily on his heart is his father's death. And in fact, as the collection goes on, Berryman makes it even more clear how completely and thoroughly damaged he is by the memory of his father. And the penultimate poem in the collection, Dream Song 384, is even more explicit. In fact, the entire thing plays out basically as this really graphic fantasy about Berryman digging up his father's grave and, to not put it too fine a point on it, desecrating his father's corpse. I'm just going to read it here. I'm going to read it in its entirety, and then we can talk about how some of this might tie into Succession. The marker slants, flowerless. Days almost done. I stand above my father's grave with rage. Often, often before, I've made this awful pilgrimage to one who cannot visit me, who tore his page out. I come back for more. I spit upon this dreadful banker's grave, who shot his heart out in a Florida dawn. Oh ho, alas, alas. When will indifference come? I moan and rave. I'd like to scrabble till I got right down, away down, under the grass, and axe the casket open, ha, to see just how he's taking it, which he sought so hard. We'll tear apart the moldering grave clothes, ha! And then Henry will heft the axe once more, his final card, and fell it on the start. So yeah, that's pretty unambiguous. And those are just two poems out of almost 400. And of course there are more. There are substantially more poems in this collection where Berryman is sort of in open combat with the ghost of his father. But in order to keep this video kind of brief, I'm not going to read and reference every one of them. Instead, now let's talk about Succession. I probably don't even need to say this, but Logan's influence over his children, Logan's oppressive influence over his children, is a massive recurring theme throughout Succession, if it's not the primary theme of the series. I mean, it's kind of right there in the title, isn't it? In fact, throughout the series, you see time and time again moments where each of the Roy children are trying to break out of Logan's grasp in one way or another, whether that's trying to directly defy him or beat him in a business deal or force him to retire and succeed him, or whether it's a little bit more subtle or indirect, like trying to break the psychological patterns that he's instilled in them, trying not to behave like him, or trying not to let the many nasty things he said about them,
Roman, you're a moron,
rule their behavior and have complete control over their mind and their approach to living. You see time and time again Kendall, Roman, and Shiv trying to escape their father's influence. And this is while he's still alive. And that is one difference between the Dream Songs and Succession, which is that a major reason why Berryman, or his alter ego Henry, can't ever fully reconcile himself to the impact that his father has had on him. The major reason why he can't obtain clarity or catharsis and break his father's grip over his life is that his father died in a way that ensured that Berryman would never be able to sit down with him and have a conversation and say, hey, this is how you screwed up my life. How can we make this good? Instead, he's haunted. In a literal and a figurative way, he's haunted. Whereas for most of Succession, the Roy children don't have that problem. They can sit down with Logan. They try to sit down with Logan and make it right on a few occasions. And something always gets in the way. Something always undermines that attempt. But, of course, now, spoiler alert, Logan is dead. And so for the remaining episode of the series, the Roy children are very much in the same position as Berryman's Henry is, as Berryman himself was, with a father who exists only as a ghost, only as a memory, only as a kind of psychological demon. And so I do wonder, moving forward, if that's going to be significant. If I'll look back at this video in a few weeks and say, oh, I can see even more clearly now the point of intersection between the Dream Songs and Succession. I do wonder, and this is a little bit of a tangent, it seems inevitable that we're going to see Logan's funeral. And given the rather graphic way Henry handles his grief in the poem, Berryman imagines handling his grief in the poem. If Logan's funeral isn't going to get ugly,
Complete disinheritance. Won't even speak at your memorial.
I kind of imagine, given the way Succession functions, that it's going to get ugly in a more subtle, interpersonal way with a lot of nasty dialogue and a lot of vicious back and forth between the characters. I kind of doubt that it's going to go full slapstick with, Logan's corpse being rolled out of his coffin and violated or whatever in some way, beat up or something. I kind of doubt that's going to happen, but I do think it's very interesting that the climax of the Dream Songs, the penultimate Dream Song, is this moment of just direct, violent confrontation between Berryman and his dead father. And the final arc of Succession has been about Logan's death and seems to be building up towards Logan's funeral. I do wonder if there's not going to be an emotionally similar climax, if not a literally similar climax between the two works. But that aside, even if we don't end up seeing Logan's funeral on screen, which seems really unlikely, it's unequivocal that thematically there's a real similarity between what's happening in the Dream Songs and what's happening in Succession. In that, dead or alive, these works are about fathers who have a massive, oppressive, commandeering impact and influence over their children, and are about the struggles of those children to reconcile themselves to their relationship with their father and to free themselves from their father's influence and their father's memory. And that, in and of itself, even if there were no other similarities or connections between the Dream Songs and Succession, would, I think, be enough to justify repeatedly referencing Dream Song 29 in episode titles. But, as I intimated at the top, I think there are plenty of more connections to be found here. And so I'm going to record some more videos. So if you found this somehow and you're watching this, stay tuned for that.
That could be it. The end.
The end? Come on.